That one.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
But I don't think I'm on the streaming.
You're not on streaming? I'm on. Oh, yeah.
I'm not.
This is. Yeah, because it's only a slide, eh? So if I go now to, let's say, um, color bars, bars, and should give it this, it should go, it should be,
Just get like
yeah, that's strange.
slides.
If you refresh, though,
Because for the lights streaming.
streaming, oh, this is the one.
You have to see what's that.
So,
Oh, you're also doing that.
yeah, that's not from us. Can I
Alright, no
change?
problem.
No.
But from our end, you will need this microphone,
Yeah,
and apart, everything is okay to you.
yeah, yeah. No, oh, no, it's right. I'm back. So I'm now live.
I'm just gonna speak in the microphone. We'll see.
Yeah.
Test. 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 Test.
Yeah.
Test.
Yeah. So that's for the audio, and I use that one for me
Okay.
directly.
All right.
Okay, it's about
Perfect.
10 seconds, I think.
The latency.
Yeah.
Cool. I'm gonna have a look in that auditoria.
Yeah.
I'll
Thank you
be-
very much.
I'll be around.
Okay, thank you.
Ja, goedemiddag, goedenavond. Even een stemtest. Ja, goedemiddag, goedenavond. Even een stemtest.
zal wat afwisselen. Ja.
But I think I've already introduced Christophe. Is everybody heard? Are there any new persons?
Maybe online.
Yeah. Okay, then I will read again the text that I record the best. Yeah. So where have we put it? Right here.
I do more.
Yeah. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We can start. I'm just here for a few seconds to reintroduce Christophe van Gerwe, who was our guest this afternoon for the rewording seminar, or is this the rewording lecture? And the other one was just the seminar. We are keep on rewording the whole time, whatever that might mean. But the only thing that I have to say about Christophe is that he is an architect engineer trained in the locally prestigious architecture department of the Ghent University. He has also studied literature theory at the KU Leuven, and he's a assistant professor of architecture theory at the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, where he specialized is obviously in architecture theory. He's also a novel writer, an editor of two important journals, Oase for architecture theory and De Witte Raaf for our Flemish, Netherlands, Dutch, let's say, cultural landscape. He's the author of a few works on mainly OMA and Rem Koolhaas when it comes to architecture theory, but as I was saying, also of a couple of standard works on architecture theory, like choosing architecture, and another fascinating way of getting into his intellectual landscape is through his novels that I think are also a very important contribution to the, let's say, European culture. So Christophe will talk about the possibility of self-criticism tonight. So the floor is yours, Christophe.
Yes, thank you, Vlad, for the introduction, and thanks again for the invitation. So, like I said, it's a bit difficult for me since we already have a very valuable and interesting workshop. So a lot of the ideas that I discuss in my lecture have already been somewhat superseded by many of the suggestions of the students, but I'll nevertheless will focus on the text. I thought a lot about what I could present you, something that could, given the diversity of your topics, could nevertheless be interesting to all of you. And so I decided to address the possibility of self-criticism, something that has been, in a way, unconsciously, mostly unconsciously, has been on my mind for a while now. And the question I would like to begin with is the question of how we can know whether we evaluate ourselves more often than we evaluate other people. So how much time do we devote to the behavior of others, and how much time do we devote to our own behavior? And can these two activities be separated? So for example, I might be asking myself the question whether I'm doing a good job right now by introducing this lecture in this way or by addressing this kind of topic. But that kind of question is, of course, immediately informed by my assessment, so to say, of who you are and of what you are thinking and expecting, what you like, what you want, of what a good lecture should be, today in general and in this former prison in particular. So you could say that the most solipsistic thinking is actually deeply informed and influenced by an interaction with other people. Given that, it might even be more difficult to find out if the criteria that I use to evaluate my own performance are similar to the criteria I use to evaluate your performance. So are we more strict for ourselves than for others, or is the opposite true? Do we always treat others more stricter and with more scrutiny than we treat ourselves? There is a rather famous passage in the Bible, in the book of Matthew, in which Jesus says that the first and great commandment is the following: "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy mind." So this kind of advice might seem a bit old-fashioned, but the second important commandment stipulated by Jesus goes like this: "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." So, in different, more contemporary terms, the evaluation criteria I use for myself should be identical to the criteria I use for you. And it is in that sense maybe a bit strange that Jesus decides to use the word love. He explicitly says, "Love your neighbor," although you could say he's of course Jesus and not just any ordinary human being. But you could also say there are more reasons to dislike your neighbor than to like him. When you live in an apartment block, for example, neighbors can show up in the hallway exactly at those moments when you don't feel like meeting anyone. And there are other examples to sort of indicate that when you would love your neighbor as yourself, this doesn't exactly mean that, or that it is quite difficult to really specifically love your neighbor. Also, the other part of the equation, so love your neighbor as yourself, is strange because it is very likely that we dislike many of our own characteristics. So I don't think that anyone exists who is continuously happy with him or herself and who does not, at least once a day, suffer from his or own behavior. And if this person would exist, so a person that is continually satisfied with everything he thinks, feels, says, or does, I don't think I would like to have that person as my neighbor. But I wouldn't, however, mind now and then being someone like that a bit more often. So to stop, let's say, being subjected to your own criticism and scrutiny, or to be, in other words, constantly applauding yourself for everything that happens. Actually, that might be a possible definition of happiness. While unhappiness is exactly the opposite, never being satisfied with whatever you do, you find, think, feel, or say. There is this great song by Bob Dylan, Positively 4th Street, that he supposedly wrote to attack folk musicians in New York in the 1960s or to lash out at an ex-lover. But it's also possible to consider that the you he is addressing in his lyrics is actually himself. So when he sings, "I wish that for just one time you could stand inside my shoes, you'd know what a drag it is to see you." So it might be likely that he is also addressing himself. So if I, again returning to the commandment of Jesus, have to love my neighbor as myself, it is quite possible that I should actually hate my neighbor, because that I love myself is anything but a fact. And now and again, we all hate ourselves, no matter how unconsciously. So simply suggesting that you should love your neighbor just like we love ourselves, by doing that, Jesus is actually simplifying or even repressing the ambivalence that is constitutional for our lives. There is never any hate without love, and there is no love without hate. And if someone can satisfy us, they can frustrate us too. But if someone can frustrate us, we always believe that they can satisfy us. This is true, I guess, for our relationship with other people, but it is even more true for our relationship with ourselves. We are never alone because we are, to a higher or lesser degree, conscious beings. And we are therefore always our very own neighbor, and probably our most important and omnipresent neighbor too, or at least the only neighbor that will never move to another place. Therefore, the advice to love thyself as thy neighbor can, in that sense, become rather obvious. In Freudian or psychoanalytical terms, of course, what we are dealing with, or what I have been talking about, is the superego. This kind of higher instance of power that resides as a midget or as a giant or something in between in all of us. The superego that in cartoons or comics books used to be represented by a devil on your left shoulder and an angel on your right is somewhat the internal voice that controls, or that at least comments and evaluates everything we think or do. And of course the origins of this creature are quite unclear and also ambiguous, but it is certain and also probably obvious that the superego originates on the one hand in the past, in our past, in what happened to us during our childhood and certainly in our relationship with our parents, and on the other hand in the present, so that is to say in society. The criteria we develop for self-criticism are always at the same time therefore highly personal but also highly general or generic. They originate in our individual lives, but also in what you could call the zeitgeist, the episteme, or the culture we are a part of. So what this means in more theoretical terms is that psychoanalysis, which is actually you could say the sort of examination you can undergo exactly in order to come to terms with your own superego, the very fact that this superego is simply never related or never exclusively related to your parents and to your past, but also to society, you could say, of course, that what that means in theoretical terms is that psychoanalysis has been succeeded or supplemented, possibly even like some kind of booster vaccine, third dose, by theoretically speaking, structuralism. So by the knowledge and the consciousness that we are, for better or for worse, never isolated subjects. When we speak, and particularly when we speak to ourselves or have internal conversations, others are constantly speaking too. Our voice, the voice inside of our head, is never our own voice. And even when we think we are hearing our own voice, we are constantly also hearing other voices. So you could say that if the invention or the discovery of the superego and thus of psychoanalysis at the beginning of the 20th century revealed the voice of the superego inside of us, what you could call structuralism in the second half of the 20th century made it clear that this voice is actually a composition, a mixture of many other voices, almost like somewhat a constant shuffle between genres, time periods, regions, and languages. Now, the question, or one of the questions by now, is of course what this has to do with you and with the context of this lecture, with PXL, LUCA, ARC, and ARCK, and ARK, and with writing or working on a PhD in the arts or in architecture, and more general with doing artistic and design research, or even more general, doing creative and intellectual work at the same time. Well, I think that all these things that I sort of essayistically have crossed, so the ambivalence that enters the game as soon as we start thinking about ourselves, but also the almost inexhaustible sources that are both very personal and very cultural in nature that our superego has at its disposal for self-criticism. I think that all these things are applicable almost in an exemplary fashion to what artists do, and even to what happens or should or could happen in the humanities or in intellectual work or head work in general. So differently put, the ambivalence between self-consciousness and self-criticism and the difficult equilibrium between self-love and self-hate is also at work when we work. We can never be sure of the value of what we do, and neither can we ourselves fully explain our own activities. And yet, exactly that is what is, on a very large basis, required or requested of us. So I think more or less of anyone living today, but I think more specifically, and the us I'm addressing here is, so let's say everyone working in an art school or a university. So on the one hand, we have to prove and convince ourselves that what we do is good or simply better than what other people are doing. But on the other hand, we have to explain what we do. We have to express its meaning, interpret it, analyze it, and show what kinds of knowledge it produces. So you could say that, in other words, we are all expected to be our own critics and to continually profess self-criticism. This is, after all, you could say what criticism means. So on the one hand, evaluation, and on the other hand, also interpretation, looking for meaning. And it's possible that in our contemporary society, everyone is more or less invited, or it's likely that today everyone is more often invited to focus on his or herself. So if you take one example, it has often been declared that criticism in art and literature is in crisis or does no longer exist. And we addressed this afternoon too. I think this is only partly so, but it is certainly true that when critics become less numerous, that the activities of critics, so people who sort of review books, artworks, the work of artists, when these critics become less numerous, their activities do keep on existing, but they end up in the hands of the artists, of the writers or scholars themselves, who then indeed are invited to become their own critics, or are invited to sort of supply explanations of their own work. So possibly this is obvious, but I'll say it anyway, that a lot of what I am saying is colored by my own experiences. So as Vlad said in the introduction, both as a writer or a literary author and as an academic in the humanities, a part of an engineering school, in architecture theory, history and criticism. So for example, to focus first on the literary aspect, between 2012 and 2017, as Vlad said, I have published 3 novels in Dutch. And what I experienced, looking back now and summarizing it roughly, is somewhat how old-fashioned my expectations concerning literary reception are, and probably still were. So on the one hand, I assumed that it would not be necessary, and possibly even impolite, to indicate how wonderful my own books are. So I didn't, and actually I still don't consider it my task to be my own critic in that sense, by evaluating and, of course, possibly also promoting my own work. And perhaps understandably, I have probably also for that reason never been on television, thanks to one of my books. There was one time in 2013, when my debut novel won a prize, that I came very close to being on television. It was during one of these events, the so-called Boekenbeurs in Antwerp, one of the more happy casualties of COVID. In the early evening, so a camera was directed at my face and a journalist put a microphone under my nose and he said, "Now tell us why we should read your book and not another book." And I did reply, but I don't remember what I said, and in each case the journalist, or possibly as editor-in-chief, wasn't convinced because the reply was recorded, but to my knowledge it has never been broadcast. And bit related to that, another moment or experience occurred when my 3rd novel was reviewed, and although the critic, so I was lucky enough to have a review, and the critic expressed some praise for the book, he was in the end rather dismissive because he couldn't really put his finger on the meaning or the message of the book, and suggested also that this should have been presented more clearly from the start, in the form of, let's say, solutions or some kind of advice, again something that I have always been reluctant to do. In my other professional life, so as a professor in architectural theory, I think I have similar but also slightly different experiences that have to do because I have a kind of so-called tenure track position, which means that during 6 years I actually have to profess a kind of continuous self-criticism in which I evaluate and analyze my own activities and subsequently also on a yearly basis present these activities to a panel that is not actually criticizing what I do, but rather criticizes the way I criticize myself. So it can get quite complicated. The question is not if my activities are valuable or insightful or original or beautifully written, but rather if I am able to present them strategically and convincingly. So I have to indicate why a certain book or article is important, and I have to explain that kind of book or that kind of article is exactly what I wanted to achieve from the beginning, and then also explain why exactly what I wanted to achieve with that book or with that article, and then also illustrate why this and not something else could be of importance not only for the institution I am working on, but also for the society at large on the other hand. So I think that the main question that I've been circling around now for a while is also present in my title of the lecture. Is such a thing even possible? Is self-criticism possible? Is it possible from a theoretical point of view? So are human beings truly capable of self-criticism? But is it also possible from a historical point of view? Do we also live in an age in which self-criticism is encouraged? So in an age in which you can openly criticize yourself in a negative way, and does express your doubts about whether or not you actually believe in yourself. So if you interpret self-criticism not only as a kind of explanation, or but also as sort of negative evaluation. Now, as you may know, the term self-criticism, once you start to, let's say, Google and research it, has not only a psychological or psychoanalytical side, but it also has a political aspect or political history. And one of the reasons why it came to my attention, or why I became interested in it as a theoretical and historical problem, is my, let's say, interest or obsession with the work of an architect, a Dutch architect, namely Rem Koolhaas, born in 1944 and co-founder of OMA in 1975, the Office for Metropolitan Architecture. And 6 years ago, I decided to publish a book in which the most important critical writings on the work of OMA and Koolhaas are collected. So this book, a kind of anthology or reader, not of texts that I've written myself, but texts that were written between the 70s and the end of the century in many different languages, and often also texts that had never been collected before onto the pages of one book. Actually, I think that this project, and I realized that actually on the occasion of this lecture, and because of the open invitation that preceded it, that it might indicate my own somewhat personal but professional preoccupation with criticism, and thus with criteria. So actually with knowing what to do and also knowing what not to do, and more specifically with this kind of curiosity in the behavior of other people. How do other people decide which decisions and which choices they can make? I also, for example, that is related, let's say, methodologically related or thematically related. I wrote my PhD in architectural sciences exactly by analyzing and interpreting the work of Geert Bekaert, who you see here, an influential Belgian architecture critic from the late 20th century. But returning to Koolhaas and self-criticism, one of the things that initiated the anthology was the fact that he, as an architect, was almost obsessed with analyzing his own activities, and thus with the possibility of self-criticism. So Koolhaas is if you don't know his work or his presence, is actually one of there are many architects, but he is, you could say, very eloquent, but he also has often been interviewed and has also written quite a lot about his own work. So you could say, in terms of reflection or self-reflection, he is very present as an architect. And he is interested in the possibility of self-criticism. He actually said so himself at the beginning of a lecture he gave at the Technical University in Delft in 1990, a symposium entitled How Modern is Dutch Architecture. And to respond to this question, several people were invited, but also Koolhaas was asked to give a presentation. And in 1990, he started this lecture with the following words. I have always been fascinated by what in communist ideology is called self-criticism. This is a procedure whereby intellectuals are periodically forced to publicly confess their failings. After, I can only assume, a highly unpleasant trial and often with the worst possible outcome. While it would surely never reach such extremes in our country, in our civilization, the procedure is quite unknown here. And what he does in that lecture subsequently is exactly, you could say, subject his work to self-criticism, or one project in particular. This project built during the 80s, a large social housing project in Amsterdam that is still there, that has actually been protected or preserved officially beginning of this year. And so it's actually what you can see when you are at the back of the central station of Amsterdam. But more important for this occasion is, of course, that notion of self-criticism. And it is indeed, as Koolhaas says, a philosophical and political concept developed within the ideology of Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism, but also Maoism. And it was actually developed, as historical research has come to show, as a sort of way to publicly interrogate intellectuals who were suspected of possessing counter-revolutionary positions. So it were actually members of the Communist Party who had fallen out of favor, were sometimes forced to undergo self-criticism sessions and then producing either written or verbal statements detailing their ideological errors and affirming after this their renewed belief in the party line. And more often, of course, they were not capable of doing so, and then they were simply eliminated. So as a strategy or a tactic, it is a bit more violent and destructive, as Koolhaas, of course, somewhat ironically presupposed at the beginning of that lecture from 1990. And to illustrate that, there is a text from 1928, an article by Stalin, published, of course, in Russian, against vulgarizing the slogan of self-criticism, in which he wrote the following: I think, comrades, that self-criticism is as necessary to us as air or water. I think that without it, without self-criticism, our party could not make any headway, could not disclose our ulcers, could not eliminate our shortcomings. And shortcomings we have in plenty. That must be admitted frankly and honestly. Now, by showing you this sort of historical, or by means of Koolhaas, this historical practice of self-criticism, it's not my intention to go so far to suggest that we are living today in a kind of totalitarian state, or in a kind of neo-communist civilization in which we are continuously subjected to self-criticism. But it is at least remarkable, I think, that particularly artists or writers are expected to, if not to criticize their own activities, then at least to openly reflect upon them. So by showing their value, their goals, their objectives, and their immediate returns or impacts to society and also to the institutions they work for. Now, of course, and this is one of the things we discussed this afternoon, understanding or trying to understand your activities, reflecting on them, thinking about your work, your artistic or intellectual decisions, you could say that is what modern beings do. But the question is rather how public this activity of self-reflection and self-criticism can or should be, and more importantly, by whom it can be instigated or requested. So the very notion of self-criticism becomes somewhat absurd, I think, if, as in the case of Stalin, it becomes an obligation rather than a desire within yourself. Similarly, it probably does not make much sense to make psychoanalysis obligatory, because you could argue some people are simply immune to psychoanalysis. In a few days, I read in the newspaper something similar concerning COVID vaccination, that people who don't want to get vaccinated should also not be obliged to get vaccinated, because if you don't want it, the vaccine will not work. Which, if only because you will develop imaginary diseases. Now, unfortunately, as we have seen, it's not because you want the vaccine that the vaccine does work. But in each case, it shows that also there is something strange in a kind of self-criticism that is, let's say, subjected or at least encouraged or rejected or enforced from above. You could say that when you are really invited to self-criticism, what always happens is that your own super-ego almost inevitably gets replaced by the ego of the higher power who has invited you to criticize yourself. So the voice of the institution becomes dominant, or can become dominant, in the conversation you have with yourself or with your other so-called internal voices, knowing, of course, that these internal voices are always at least partly external. And as we have seen, I hope this afternoon, there is no other text or few other texts to my knowledge that embody and express this somewhat conundrum of self-reflection, invited self-reflection, obliged self-reflection, better than the introduction Thomas Pynchon wrote to his collection of stories from 1984, Slow Learner. So, as an introduction also for the people following online, Pynchon, born in 1937, is for many reasons a remarkable author, but one of them is that there are no recent pictures of him available. So on the left you see a photo of him as a student in a yearbook, and on the right is a picture that was made using this kind of software that police also uses to imagine how old someone looks today. And yeah, so I think if Pynchon really looks like that, he's even more ugly than when he was a teenager. But so this very absence of your portrait, or the almost absence of a recent portrait, is in itself, I think, already a major achievement for an artist that has, for example, also been attained, as you probably know, by Belgian fashion designer Martin Margiela. Specifically because Pynchon is quite famous, so he occupies an important position in a literary American tradition. Another thing related to that reluctance to go public is that there are no interviews of him available. So you could say that an interview is a bit like testing your own conscience, and it can also be interpreted as an invitation to self-criticism, theoretically. So Pynchon is a writer without interviews, without almost any photographs, and also without non-fictional text. So he never wrote an essay or a review. So he only exists by means of his novels and his stories. So it was quite, in 1984, remarkable that he published this collection of early stories, and that he also decided to write an introduction to the book that can be considered more or less as a kind of written supplement to the kind of artistic or literary achievements that he developed during his 20s and 30s. Now, the question is, as I think we have discussed also, as some review and as also other reviewers and scholars have argued, that the introduction to the book is actually the first story, which you can also see with some over-interpretation possibly from the table of contents. So the fact that the introduction is just another title, like the titles of the 5 other stories, might indicate that it's actually the first story of this collection of stories, rather than the real introduction. And what is going on in this text is, well, you can, I think, interpret it in many ways, but one possibility is calling it an instance of irony. So what Pynchon is writing is something else than what he actually means, and in some cases even the opposite. Another option might be to refer to the notion of the so-called unreliable narrator, term coined in 1961 by Wayne C. Booth in his book The Rhetoric of Fiction. An unreliable narrator is a voice on paper that the reader shouldn't believe, or a voice that actually that actually exists to test the gullibility or the naivety of the reader, and a test that therefore can be the source of quite profound reading pleasure, because in a sense all narrators are to a certain degree unreliable, and trying to find out to what degree they are telling the truth or not is in many cases can be part of the reasons why you read novels or fictional texts. So there are many I don't have the first page here, but there are many instances during this text or during this introduction that Pynchon is deliberately installing a certain kind of doubt about what he is saying. He writes, for example, "as nearly as I can remember," or "I now pretend to have reached a level of clarity." And some scholars have therefore made comparisons between the introduction of this text of book and of this book of stories and speeches by Ronald Reagan, who was of course the president during the 1980s, and who also often has claimed power exactly by denying responsibility, but who also had, as you can see in this picture, had a hearing aid and sometimes referred to his bad ear when he was in trouble following some wrong decisions, simply by stating that he didn't hear what was being decided because he has a bad ear, which is exactly what Pynchon is doing in this introduction. Another remarkable thing for the introduction is that Pynchon is quite negative about a lot of his stories. And therefore, the text itself has been interpreted as a sort of confession or even a kind of midlife crisis. So when Pynchon was writing or publishing the book, it was 1984, he was 47, and he hadn't published a novel since Gravity's Rainbow from 1973. So it is, in the end, possible to read the introduction not as a real or a traditional introduction, but rather as a short story or a metafictional short story, and as an experiment in narrative. And it's also here that the title of the book, Slow Learner, a title that Pynchon doesn't explain or that isn't mentioned in the introduction, can nevertheless become meaningful. So Slow Learner seems to indicate that Pynchon is actually that. He is a slow learner, not only so slow that, as he himself states, his early work is rather mediocre in quality, but even so slow that he, in his late 40s, still hasn't learned what to do as a fictional writer, given the fact that he hasn't published a new book in 10 years. But there is also another possibility, and that has to do with the title of another book, namely 1984 by George Orwell, which was of course 1984, published in 1948. But 1984 was the year in which Slow Learner was published. And there is the following passage in the book, or there is a passage in the book that indicates sort of close connection to the book by Thomas Pynchon. So 1984 is, as you probably know, the story of Winston Smith. He is living in a totalitarian state, and he has a day job at the Ministry of Truth to rewrite past entries in the newspaper so they fit better into the current party ideology. So his job is to criticize the past when it doesn't stroke with what the party finds important, and subsequently to rewrite it. But that is what he does for a living. But at home, he keeps a diary in which he tries to tell the truth by historicizing fiction. So the diary is discovered, and soon afterwards he is tortured because he was keeping that kind of diary. And at first he is so he is tortured and then sort of forced to rewrite his own diary. You could say again in an act of self-criticism. So to revise those writings so they are more in line with party language and ideology. And at first he refuses, but then he gets more electric shock therapy until he is finally able to say, among other things, that 2 + 2 = 5. This famous passage in the book, which of course isn't true, but that's exactly the point. And then there is this one sentence in the book in which the guardian or the torturer of Winston is of course relieved that Winston is finally obeying, and he says, almost as a reward, "You are a slow learner, Winston," which is of course exactly the title of the book, by Slow Learner by Pynchon. So in that sense, the introduction is, you could say, is written from the point of view of someone who has been converted, so who is, after enough self-criticism and torture, finally prepared to obey and to follow the party line, which means that he actually stops telling the truth and is prepared to say things like 2 + 2 = 5. But from another point of view, this is of course exactly what doesn't happen, because Pynchon did not write a real and honest introduction that was likely requested by his publisher. He does not want to learn, and he does not want to be as transparent and as critical as possible about his own works. So he remains, even by means of that introduction, hidden, and he does not produce a text that is not part of his oeuvre and that we can use as an explanation of his intentions. Actually, such a text does not exist. So just like a recent photograph of Pynchon or an interview with him still doesn't exist. All we have is the novels, the work, and the work, so without the written supplement. And the character of literature and of art in general, which is, and I use here a quote from another text we discussed this afternoon by Peter Osborne, that character is the capacity at once to produce and to withhold meaning through the articulation of a totality of components in a manner that engages yet remains irreducible to discourse. That character is preserved. Now, of course, to be clear, I wouldn't suggest Pynchon as an example or as the only example or even as a model to follow when it comes to criticizing, presenting, selling, describing, or introducing your own work. And Pynchon is likely not a model, is in that same sense not a model for myself. When I have to present or introduce my work, I don't really try to be an unreliable narrator, just like I haven't been trying to be an unreliable narrator this afternoon or this evening. So again, he is also not a sort of model for you or for someone else. The strategy of irony or unreliability or of undermining your own discourse might be useful, but it certainly is not the only strategy. But I think what the introduction and the example of Pynchon do show is that we can always try to be conscious of the historicity and the relativity of our activities. So it's not because in a certain moment of time things seem to go one way that they shouldn't or couldn't evolve in something different. And there is, in other words, also a kind of limit to what we can expect from ourselves. What we do in the humanities, but also as human beings in general, is in a way exploring those limits and charting them. But I think to really cross those limits, it is probably necessary to stop the process of self-criticism, or at least to decide to keep it private and possibly even hidden. So thank you. That is what I wanted to present to you, and that what we also already have discussed, of course, this afternoon. But if there are other questions today or suggestions or people online who would like to react, that would be certainly possible.
We're done with so many people that you need a mediator, so this kind of introduce.
But
you're not the leader, so.
no, that's the difference. But did you have experiences with self-criticism during your childhood? No, I mean it existed, or?
No, that's for my autobiography. That's
I would ask you to be. I would ask you.
Obviously, everybody did. Everybody did.
You mean automatically?
Yeah, in a way or another, in an institution that is run by the state, obviously. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. But that's also a way to think critically. To learn how to think critically and about the fiction of criticism, especially.
You mean because of the self-criticism you learn
You
to
learn
become
you learn how criticism works, which is already something.
Yeah.
Because I don't think that everybody nowadays knows how criticism works. I mean, everybody expects the applause, but that's not criticism. That's not.
But does it lead to a sort of faking of criticism, or is it always very honest criticism that one would then?
Oh, but that's, you know that, I mean, everybody knows that. I mean, everybody who's older than 40 knows that in a totalitarian regime, if you want to work within the system, you should never completely believe what the system says. Like party leaders that go opt other leaders are very skeptical of fanatics. That's a rule.
Incredible.
Yeah, and I think that artists too. I mean, artists too, and that meet critics who always applaud them, or promoters who always tell their students they're so amazing. You kind of run away from them, don't you? Unless you're somebody's, I mean, it's a lack of experience or intelligence.
But I was more interested in if you are demanded to perform this criticism, or as you have referred to that, wouldn't you then start to perform something that is not sincere? I mean, would you fake this self-criticism, and then probably faking self-criticism is, if you do it publicly, then you would have an agenda, probably in the sense that maybe this tension has an agenda somewhere.